Hey guys, tonight we time travel to one of the slowest, most uneventful, and quite possibly the most pointless conflicts in human history. There are no sword fights, no battlefield trumpets, no heroic standoffs, not even a single angry letter, really. This is the story of a war so uneventful, it went on for 335 years, and somehow managed zero casualties. You heard that right. 3 centuries. Zero action. It's basically the historical version of someone saying, I'm mad at you, then ghosting you for a few lifetimes. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Comment below with your location and what time it is right now. I always love seeing where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand on the southern coast of England. The air is thick with sea salt, and the wind plays with the corners of your coat like it's flirting. Behind you, England is busy doing English things, arguing about taxes, boiling cabbage, and sending ships everywhere. But ahead of you, just off the coast, is a small, rocky cluster of islands called the Isles of Scilly. You've probably never heard of them. That's okay. Most of history forgot them too. But it's 1651, and you are about to become part of the most underwhelming conflict imaginable, the 335 years war between the Netherlands and these tiny British islands. It's technically a war. It's also technically nothing at all. The story begins with one very awkward breakup. England is in a full-blown civil war. On one side, you've got the royalists, loyal to the crown. They're dramatic, wear feathers, and believe in divine right. On the other, you've got the parliamentarians, led by Oliver Cromwell, basically the guy who read too many rules and thought, you know what, let's cancel kings. You, unfortunately, are stuck in the middle. And by you, I mean you're a Shalonian, a resident of the Isles of Scilly. You grow potatoes. You fish. Sometimes you yell at seagulls. It's not a glamorous life, but it's peaceful. Until it's not. Because while England tears itself apart, the Isles of Scilly decide to side with the royalists. Not because you love monarchy, honestly, you just want to be left alone, but because the royalist navy is using your harbors. They arrive with big ships, big flags, and bigger attitudes, and suddenly your quiet island is involved in a war you didn't sign up for. Meanwhile, across the sea, the Dutch Republic is watching. Back in the 1600s, the Dutch are not just biking through tulip fields. They are a global maritime powerhouse. Ships, trade, cheese, diplomacy, and cannons, if necessary. They've recently made alliances with the English parliamentarians, but they're a bit annoyed. Why? Because royalist privateers, basically sea pirates with fancy paperwork, are using the Isles of Scilly to attack Dutch merchant ships. Imagine that. You're sailing peacefully with a ship full of stroopwafels and suddenly, bam, cannonballs and muskets. It's bad for business. Very bad. So the Dutch send a fleet to investigate. Their commander, Admiral Martin Harpertzoon-Tromp, yes, that's a real name, shows up off the coast of the Isles and delivers an ultimatum. Stop attacking our ships, or we'll declare war. Now here's the funny part. England is a mess. The central government can't control the royalists, and the royalists can't even control their own navy. So nobody replies. Tromp waits. Then waits more. Finally, with the elegance of a man sick of waiting, he shrugs and says, fine, war it is. And that's it. That's the entire declaration. No shots fired. No land invaded. No follow-up. He sails away shortly afterward, presumably to yell at someone or find more cheese. You, meanwhile, are left standing on a windy island, technically at war with the Dutch Republic. Congratulations. Now, here's where it gets hilariously strange. That technical declaration of war never got rescinded. For centuries, nobody fought. Nobody died. Nobody even remembered. But on paper, for 335 years, your tiny island and one of the most powerful naval empires of the 17th century were enemies. Like when someone says, "We should totally catch up soon," and then doesn't speak to you again until 3 lifetimes later. Except this time, it's two countries. The sillies don't send a reply. Mostly because you don't have a navy. Or an army. Or a reason. The Dutch don't follow up. Because why bother? There are bigger wars happening. The 30 Years' War is wrapping up. England's Civil War is still raging. France is being French. Nobody really cares about the angry little declaration tossed at a few rocks off the British coast. Still, it lingers. Legally, the war has begun. But spiritually, it's already over. You go back to fishing. You eat boiled potatoes. The war becomes a rumor, then a myth, then a historical hiccup nobody really talks about. But occasionally, someone remembers. A Dutch historian digs through old naval logs. A British clerk raises an eyebrow. Wait, are we still technically at war? And every time, the answer is, yeah, kinda. Let's toss in a historical fact to ground us. By the 1650s, the Dutch Republic had the largest merchant fleet in the world. They were trading everywhere, from Indonesia to South Africa to the Caribbean. So why would they care about a few pirates hiding out on some foggy British rocks? They wouldn't. Not really. But back then, image was everything. If you didn't respond to a threat, your allies started questioning your spine. So this war was more about saving face than actual vengeance. Now for something quirky. The sillies were so forgotten, some maps didn't even label them separately from Cornwall. They were just vague blobs. So imagine being declared enemies by a global superpower and not even being visible on half the maps in Europe. Humbling, really. And now a scholarly debate for flavor. Scholars still argue whether Admiral Trump's declaration was ever officially sanctioned by the Dutch Parliament. Some say it was just a local naval reaction, never logged into the national record. Others claim it held legal weight, even without formal follow-up. The truth is foggy, which fits the mood of this sleepy little war. Back on your island, you occasionally hear rumors. The Dutch are planning an invasion. They've already forgotten about us. The war's over. No, wait, it's not. But nothing happens. No ships appear. No letters arrive. Not even a politely worded threat. Just wind and waves. And the faint sound of someone boiling something somewhere, probably cabbage again. You live your whole life under the shadow of a war that nobody really thinks about. Then your children do the same. Then their children. And for the next few centuries, the war just sits there. Like an unopened email. A forgotten tab in your browser. A passive-aggressive feud where nobody even remembers why they were mad in the first place. And as you drift off to sleep tonight, just remember. You're still at war. You wake up the next morning to the same salty breeze sweeping over the Isles of Scilly. The sun dapples through the clouds, casting a pale golden light over the rocky shores and little cottages that dot the islands. You rub your eyes, maybe brew some tea, and wonder, what exactly does it mean to be at war when there's no enemy to fight? Because, honestly, the Isles of Scilly are about as lively as a sleepy cat in a sunbeam. You wander the narrow lanes, the cobbled paths weaving between low stone walls covered with creeping ivy and wildflowers, and you realize how wonderfully out of the way this place is. The islands sit like forgotten jewels, just off the southwestern tip of Cornwall, England. They're small, just enough to support a few thousand people, and charmingly stubborn. The ocean sprays misty kisses on the cliffs, and seagulls squawk their usual complaints. But here's the thing. For over 3 centuries, these peaceful isles were technically at war with a country across the sea. You might think being a little forgotten is bad enough, but being at war with the Dutch Republic and nobody even showing up. That's next level awkward. It's like being stood up on a date, then the other person insists the date is still on every year, without ever calling or texting. The Isles have always been a bit of an oddity. The climate is mild, thanks to the Gulf Stream, but farming is tough. You grow potatoes, kale, and wildflowers, and you fish in the clear waters. Life is simple, slow, and close to nature. You'd imagine the last thing you'd want is a war that drags on for centuries with zero action. And yet, here you are. In 1651, the Isles had just been caught up in England's Civil War drama. The Royalists were clinging to power, and the Isles were their safe harbor. But once the Dutch declared war over Royalist privateering, everything slowed to a crawl. So slow, in fact, that no one bothered to update their calendars. You stroll past a weathered pub by the harbor, its sign swinging lazily in the wind. You step inside, and the smell of salt, wood, and ale fills your nostrils. The locals gather around, chatting about the weather, fishing, and sometimes, the war that never happened. It's almost like a local joke, something your grandma mentions with a wink and a shake of the head. Remember, lad, we're still at war with the Dutch, but don't hold your breath for a fight, someone says, smiling. You laugh because that's the kind of story that only makes sense here, where time is measured in tides rather than years. Now, why exactly would the Dutch care about some rocky isles off England's coast? Back then, the Dutch Republic was a global powerhouse, riding the waves of commerce and naval dominance. They controlled trade routes stretching from the Caribbean to Southeast Asia. Protecting those routes was crucial because, well, money talks. The privateers using the Isles as their base were like rogue agents causing trouble for the Dutch's economic interests. So the Dutch sent a fleet to confront the Isles in 1651. But after declaring war, the Dutch never sent ships back to fight. You begin to wonder if the Dutch admiral just got bored, or maybe thought, these islands are more trouble than they're worth. Life on the Isles continued, slow and uneventful. Generations were born, lived, and died under the shadow of a war they barely understood. You can almost picture families passing down stories that sound like bedtime fairy tales. Remember, you're at war with the Dutch, but don't ask why. Imagine growing up with that. A conflict that's like a ghost hovering in the background, more myth than reality. The war became a curious piece of trivia rather than a threat. There's something oddly poetic about this. A war declared, never fought. Enemies who never meet on a battlefield. A conflict where no one raised a sword or fired a cannon. It's a story about the absurdity of human politics, bureaucracy, and the sometimes laughable nature of history. You think about how often wars are romanticized, flags waving, battle cries, heroic last stands. But here, there's none of that. Just quiet islands, patient seas, and the slow passage of time. A quirky fact to keep in mind. The Isles of Scilly are actually a cluster of over 140 small islands and rocks, but only 5 are inhabited. The rest are home to seabirds, seals, and stories like this one, quiet, patient, and mostly ignored by the world. Maps from the time often ignored the islands entirely or lumped them in with Cornwall. So, in a way, these islands were at war with a country that sometimes forgot they even existed. And the scholars? Well, they're still debating. Scholars still argue about whether this war was ever really official, or just a bureaucratic hiccup. Some historians say it was a naval captain's personal vendetta that got accidentally recorded as a formal declaration of war. Others believe the Dutch government just never bothered to formally end it because, well, why waste the paperwork? The truth is somewhere in the middle. But it doesn't really matter, because life here continued uninterrupted. As you wander back toward the harbor, the ocean breeze cool on your skin, you realize something important. Not every war is about glory or violence. Some wars are about pride, bureaucracy, and forgotten paperwork. Some wars are about time itself, stretching out until they become legends, half true, half forgotten. And some wars, they're so boring, so utterly pointless, that they just fade away. So, as you look out over the gentle waves, listen to the gulls, and feel the slow heartbeat of the islands beneath your feet, remember this. The war that never was, the battle that never happened, and the conflict that lasted centuries without a single shot fired, that's the story of the Isles of Scilly and the Dutch Republic. You might not survive a day in many historical battles, but here, you're more likely to survive a lifetime without ever seeing one. You find yourself stepping back into the muddy docks of the 17th century Dutch Republic, a place bustling with merchants, sailors, and the constant hum of ships being loaded and unloaded. Imagine the sharp tang of salt air mixed with the scents of tar, fresh wood, and spices brought in from far-off lands. This is the world of the Dutch, the country that, somehow, ended up in a war nobody wanted to fight but never quite forgot. So why did the Dutch get so petty? Well, it's all about reputation, alliances, and that persistent need to look tough on the international stage. Picture it. The Dutch Republic is expanding its naval power, sailing around the world, securing trade routes, and outsmarting rivals. They're flexing hard, but they also want their allies to know they mean business. When Royalist privateers used the Isles of Scilly to attack Dutch ships, it wasn't just about lost goods, it was a blow to Dutch pride. You, as a Dutch admiral, or at least, imagining yourself in that role, have just spotted a few troublesome islands off the English coast that harbor your enemies. You want to send a clear message: we don't tolerate piracy. So, you sail your fleet over, make a big fuss, and declare war on the Isles of Scilly. Only problem: you don't really have the time or resources to follow up. The Dutch Navy is busy fighting other conflicts, and the Scilly Isles, they're not exactly a prize worth risking your ships over. Here's the thing. The Dutch Republic was extremely pragmatic. They kept meticulous records of trade, taxes, and naval affairs. But this little war, it's a bureaucratic footnote, an awkwardly forgotten clause that somehow never got closed. It's like sending a strongly worded email demanding someone stop stealing your lunch from the office fridge, then forgetting to follow up, except in this case, the email lasts for centuries. Back in the Netherlands, ordinary people probably never even heard of the Isles of Scilly. They had bigger problems: wars with Spain, political intrigue, and, of course, cheese festivals. But the official Dutch government had to maintain the image of strength, even if it meant keeping up a war nobody actually wanted. So, your Dutch war effort looks a lot like paperwork, heated debates in smoky rooms, and maybe a few grumbles in taverns. Now, imagine yourself as a merchant sailor on the Dutch ships of the 1600s. You're hauling spices, wool, and silver across treacherous seas. You hear whispers of a war declared against some small English islands. You raise an eyebrow and mutter, "Did they even know where those islands are?" Then you shrug and focus on avoiding storms. This war was more about posturing than fighting. Both sides were too busy with bigger wars and politics to actually engage. England, recovering from its own civil strife, had bigger fish to fry. The Dutch were managing an empire stretching across continents. And the Isles of Scilly? Well, they were just there, quietly minding their own business. Here's a quirky detail. During this entire war, there were 0 naval battles around the Isles of Scilly. The Dutch fleet never showed up to enforce the war. In fact, the only Dutch ships seen near the islands were sometimes just passing through, probably wondering why anyone cared so much about this rocky outcrop. So, despite the official state of war, the reality was a kind of international, don't ask, don't tell. Let's toss in a historical fact here. By the mid-17th century, the Dutch Navy was considered one of the most advanced in the world. They pioneered new ship designs, mastered naval tactics, and were feared by many. Yet, they never bothered to really fight the Isles of Scilly. Talk about choosing your battles wisely. Scholars still debate the true reasons behind the Dutch declaration of war. Some suggest it was a political move designed to reassure allies and intimidate enemies. Others think it might have been an overreaction by an ambitious admiral eager to make a name for himself. Whatever the case, it's a reminder that history isn't always about clear-cut battles or dramatic speeches. Sometimes, it's just about people trying to save face. As you leave the bustling Dutch ports behind, you realize this war's real story isn't in battles or victories. It's in the absurdity of a conflict born out of petty grievances, forgotten in time, and stretching over centuries without a single casualty. And that, my friend, might just be the most fascinating thing of all. You stand again on the rocky shores of the Isles of Scilly, staring out at the endless gray-blue horizon where the sea kisses the sky. It's a quiet, misty morning, and there's a kind of magic in the air, the kind only found in places untouched by time and, apparently, by war. But here's the twist. You're supposed to be at war. Yet, nobody shows up. Not a single Dutch ship on the horizon. No cannon fire. Not even a puff of smoke from a distant skirmish. You wait. And wait. The war, it turns out, is more like a ghost story told by bureaucrats than an actual conflict. So why does no one show up? Well, first off, the Dutch Republic, busy with bigger fish to fry, never sent a fleet back to enforce the war. Their admiral's initial declaration was a big, talking point, but not much else. It's like when you and your friend agree to compete in a race and then both forget the date. Secondly, the Isles themselves are tiny, isolated, and strategically unimportant by the mid-17th century. No one really wants to deal with them. They're more trouble than they're worth. You try to imagine what this would have felt like back then. You're a local fisherman or farmer. You hear there's a war, but there's no enemy to fight. No raids. No invasions. Just the same tides rolling. In and out. Your neighbors go about their day, indifferent to the war status. It's confusing. You're technically at war, but your life is untouched. There are no enemies to hide from, no armies to dodge. And as decades roll on, the war becomes more of a formality. It's a line in dusty government ledgers, a tick box on a checklist that nobody ever updates. No battles, no casualties, just a bizarre diplomatic limbo. You look around the harbor and see ships docked peacefully, locals unloading catch and chatting about the weather. There's no hint of tension or threat. The war is a dormant volcano, present on paper but inactive in reality. It almost feels like a practical joke played by history. Sometimes, you imagine the Dutch sailors just passing by, waving lazily, exchanging pleasantries with the locals, while all the while, technically, they're enemies. You wonder if there were secret meetings where both sides agreed, let's pretend to be mad for a while. It sounds impressive. The idea of a war without a single battle challenges everything you think you know about conflict. Usually, war means chaos, noise, and fear. But this is the quietest war ever fought, a war of silence. And silence, as it turns out, is its own kind of story. Here's a quirky detail for you. The Isles of Scilly weren't just small. They were so remote that for much of the 17th and 18th centuries, news from the outside world took weeks, even months, to arrive. So the locals might have been completely unaware they were at war. They could have been fishing, farming, and going about their lives while political leaders thousands of miles away were busy playing at war. And that leads to a fascinating thought. Is a war still a war if the people involved don't know it's happening? If no shots are fired, and no one is hurt, is it just paperwork? Scholars still debate this, arguing over definitions and technicalities. You sit back on a rock, watching the waves gently lap the shore. This war teaches you that not all conflicts are fought with swords and cannons. Some wars are fought in silence, on paper, in the dusty archives of governments. And sometimes, the quietest wars leave the loudest questions. You start to realize that behind every dry fact and dusty record, there's a story about people, ordinary folks caught in the slow grind of history's wheels. On the Isles of Scilly, families went about their lives, children played in the fields, fishermen set out at dawn, and yet, all the while, their world was officially at war. It's like being stuck in a storybook where the plot is paused indefinitely. You picture an ordinary day in the 18th century. The sun rises gently over the cliffs, casting a warm glow on the low stone houses and wildflower meadows. The smell of salt and fresh bread mingles in the air. You hear the distant cry of seabirds and the gentle splash of oars against the water. Everything is calm, peaceful, unlike any war you've ever heard about. In fact, daily life was so untouched by this war that many residents probably never even knew the conflict existed. Letters and news from the mainland could take weeks to arrive, and official proclamations about the war. Those might have stayed in dusty offices, unread and ignored. The islands were tiny communities where everyone knew everyone. Life revolved around the seasons: planting, harvesting, fishing, and festivals. And perhaps, occasionally, a quiet chuckle over the absurd idea that they were at war with a distant nation nobody had ever seen. You wonder if the war ever came up during conversations at the local pub. Probably as a joke. Still at war with the Dutch, lads. Fancy that. You think about the irony. Wars are often painted as times of hardship, danger, and heroism. But here, this conflict was more like a background noise, something no one paid attention to. It almost feels like history's version of a soft reboot, an old conflict that never quite ended, but also never mattered. Still, the war was technically real. Every year, officials would mark the state of hostilities, send reports, and maintain the fiction of a conflict that refused to die. You get the sense that neither side wanted to admit it was over because, well, what else would they talk about? A fascinating oddity emerges. Because the Isles were so remote and the war so inactive, the islands developed their own unique culture, largely insulated from the turbulent politics of mainland Europe. You imagine the locals telling stories about the sea, about smugglers and fishermen, about weather and festivals. Stories that mattered to them, not some forgotten war. And yet, the shadow of this silent conflict lingered, a reminder that even the smallest places are caught up in the tides of history, whether they want to be or not. Here's a quirky detail. Despite the war lasting over 300 years, not a single casualty was ever recorded. No battle wounds, no prisoners, no heroic last stands. Just peace. Awkward, bureaucratic peace. You'd think that would make this war famous. But no, it mostly remains a curious footnote, a sleepy legend whispered among history buffs. Scholars still debate how to classify this conflict. Was it a war, a diplomatic blunder, or simply a historical oddity born from misunderstandings and stubborn pride? The truth probably lies in a mix of all three. As the sun sets over the Isles, casting long shadows on the rugged coastline, you feel a strange sense of calm wash over you. The war may have lasted centuries, but it never disturbed the peace of this place. And maybe, just maybe, that's a kind of victory all on its own. You lean against a weathered wooden fence, watching the waves roll gently onto the shore, and start thinking about how wars usually change people. Usually, conflict reshapes societies, alters borders, sparks revolutions, and rewrites history books. But here, on these sleepy isles, nothing much changed because of the war. The war was a silent ghost, an uninvited, unnoticed presence. Imagine the families living here over those 300 years. Generations come and go, children grow up, marriages happen, and crops are harvested, all under the curious label of, at war. It's almost like a background noise in their lives, like the sound of the sea or the wind in the grass. You wonder what they would think if someone told them that centuries later, people would be fascinated by their war that never was. Life in the Isles was isolated, to say the least. Traveling to the mainland was a serious journey, often risky and weather-dependent. Communication was slow. So, the official status of war might have seemed irrelevant or even ridiculous to those living day to day. The war was just a distant notion, like a strange dream drifting in and out of collective memory. Here's a fact that hits you. The island's economy wasn't driven by military might or warfare but by farming, fishing, and trade. The locals were self-sufficient, reliant on the bounties of the sea and soil. Their biggest conflicts probably involved a bad fishing season or a storm that destroyed crops. That, you realize, is a far cry from the usual stories of war with grand battles and heroic commanders. At the same time, the war kept the Isles in an odd political limbo. Technically at war with the Dutch, but under English control, the island's status was a confusing tangle of diplomacy and outdated treaties. Governments on both sides seemed to tolerate this limbo because it caused no harm and required no action. You start to appreciate the beauty of this strange situation. It shows how sometimes history isn't shaped by dramatic events but by inertia, oversight, and a touch of stubbornness. Speaking of quirks, did you know that the Isles of Scilly today have a population of about 2,000 people and attract tourists mostly for their peaceful beaches and wildlife? Little would they know that their ancestors lived in the midst of one of the world's longest wars. Scholars still discuss how this war highlights the limits of political power in the early modern period. While nations declared wars on paper, the reality on the ground, or on these small islands, could be very different. The war serves as a reminder that history is not always a straightforward tale of good versus evil or battle versus peace. Sometimes, it's about contradictions, forgotten places, and the passage of time. As the wind rustles through the grasses, you feel a profound respect for the people who lived through this odd chapter of history. They endured a war without fighting, a conflict without casualties, and a peace that was quietly maintained by inaction. You realize, maybe the real story isn't about battles or heroes, but about endurance, patience, and the odd ways history unfolds. Sometimes, the most powerful statement is made not by swords or cannons, but by silence. You're standing on the edge of a cliff, watching waves crash rhythmically against jagged rocks below, and you start to think about how history remembers wars. Usually, it's all about heroism, tragedy, and glory. But this war, it barely registers in the grand narratives. It's a footnote at best. The kind of story that gets told with a shrug and a half smile by historians who love oddities. You begin to ask yourself, why do some wars get all the attention, while others fade into obscurity? Maybe it's because this war was a war of paperwork and posturing rather than blood and fire. There were no decisive battles, no heroes to celebrate, no villains to vilify. Just two nations stuck in a bureaucratic stalemate, tangled in diplomatic red tape. It's a conflict that defies the usual storytelling. There's no climax, no dramatic turning point, just an endless stalemate stretching across centuries. You think about the nature of war itself. Is war simply a state of conflict? Or does it need action, violence, struggle, change, to truly exist? The war between the Isles of Scilly and the Dutch Republic challenges the very definition of war. It's like being told you're in a race but never actually running. This war also reveals something about the nature of power. The Dutch Republic was a formidable naval force, yet they chose not to exert that power here. England had bigger wars to fight. So both sides let this conflict drift in the background, unchallenged. Sometimes, power is shown by restraint, or indifference. You find yourself wondering how the people on both sides perceived this conflict. For the locals on the Isles, it was likely an annoying bureaucratic label that didn't affect daily life. For the Dutch, probably a forgotten footnote overshadowed by greater struggles. It's a fascinating example of how wars can be very different things to different people. Here's a quirky fact. At one point, the Isles of Scilly were actually used as a base for royalist privateers, basically pirates licensed to attack enemy ships during the English Civil War. This act partly sparked the Dutch declaration of war, but the Isles themselves remained more a nuisance than a serious threat. You can almost hear the privateers laughing about how they managed to tie two nations into a pointless war. Scholars still debate whether the war was ever truly active. Some argue it was a technicality, a diplomatic blip, while others say it reflects the complicated nature of international relations in the 17th century. This debate reminds you that history isn't just facts, it's interpretation, perspective, and sometimes, mystery. As the sun dips lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, you realize that this war's legacy is one of silence and endurance. It's a quiet story, one that invites reflection on the nature of conflict, the passage of time, and the absurdities of politics. And so you stand there, the sea breeze soft on your skin, thinking, maybe the longest war with no battles is the perfect reminder that not all wars are fought on battlefields. Some wars are fought in archives, in government offices, and in the spaces between history and myth. You wander through the narrow, winding lanes of the Isles of Scilly, feeling the rough stone walls brush against your fingertips. The islanders live simple lives, shaped by the sea and sky rather than the clash of armies. You realize this place was more a witness to history than a battlefield. The war barely touched its soil, yet it lingered in the official records like a ghost. Imagine the islanders' view. Strange proclamations from distant governments claiming war, while daily life continued undisturbed. Fishing boats sailed peacefully. Children played along the shores. The odd declaration must have seemed like a bureaucratic joke. You might even say the war was an inconvenient fiction, a shadow that didn't darken their days. This quiet conflict teaches you something profound about the distance between political decisions and lived experience. Governments wage wars, people live their lives. Sometimes, these two worlds barely overlap. Over time, the war's inertia became its own force. Neither side wanted to officially end it, lest they lose face or admit the whole thing was pointless. The result? A political stalemate stretching over 3 centuries. And that stalemate kept the Isles in limbo. Not quite at peace, not quite at war. A strange place where time seemed to stand still. You start to think about what it means to be forgotten by history. The people of the Isles lived vibrant lives, yet their story is overshadowed by this silent war. It makes you wonder how many other histories are quietly lost beneath the headlines. Here's an odd detail. During the so-called war, no new defenses were built on the Isles. No armies were stationed. No battleships patrolled its waters. It's like everyone agreed to pretend, just to keep appearances. Scholars continue to argue whether this war qualifies as a real conflict or is better described as a diplomatic blunder. It's a reminder that history isn't always black and white, it's full of gray areas and unanswered questions. As you watch the sun set behind the cliffs, you feel a sense of peace settle over the islands. This war may have lasted centuries, but its quietness is almost beautiful. Sometimes, history's silences speak louder than its battles. You find yourself aboard a small boat, the Isles of Scilly fading into the mist behind you as you drift toward the open sea. The vast ocean stretches endlessly, reminding you just how small this war was in the grand scheme of things. Across the centuries, countless real wars raged on these same seas, bloody battles, epic naval engagements, daring raids. But this conflict, it's more like a gentle ripple, barely disturbing the waters. This war makes you reconsider the nature of conflict. Usually, wars change the course of history with dramatic battles and heroic tales. But here, the conflict quietly simmers, unnoticed by the world and untouched by violence. It's almost like a slow, creeping fog, present but insubstantial. You begin to imagine the diplomatic meetings that must have happened behind closed doors. Ambassadors, scribbling notes, negotiating treaties that never quite materialized. They probably sighed, exchanged tired glances, and moved on to more pressing matters. The war was a burden nobody wanted to carry but couldn't seem to shrug off. You recall a quirky historical tidbit. The Dutch Republic's extensive bureaucracy was famous for its meticulous record keeping. Every ship's movement, every tax collected, every diplomatic letter was documented in great detail. Yet somehow, this war remained a forgotten chapter, barely mentioned in official reports. This leads you to think about how history is shaped not just by grand events but by the quiet work of clerks, diplomats, and everyday people. The war is as much a story about administrative inertia as it is about nations at odds. Scholars continue to debate whether this war was a diplomatic strategy, a bureaucratic mistake, or simply a relic of a bygone era. The debate itself reveals how history is often messy and resistant to simple explanations. As your boat drifts further into the open sea, you feel a profound sense of calm. This war wasn't fought with swords or cannons but with silence and patience. And in that silence, there's a strange kind of peace. You close your eyes, listening to the gentle rocking of the boat and the distant cry of seagulls. The war may have lasted centuries, but the sea remains unchanged, eternal, patient, and endlessly forgiving. You find yourself pacing a quiet room lit only by the flickering glow of a candle. As the shadows dance on the walls, you start to realize how this war is less about battles and more about the peculiar ways humans handle conflict. It's a reminder that sometimes, the loudest wars aren't fought with noise and fury but with quiet stubbornness and endless paperwork. You imagine the diplomatic correspondence, the letters sent back and forth between England and the Dutch Republic. Pages filled with formal declarations, polite demands, and careful refusals. All conducted with the kind of civil tone that barely hinted at the absurdity of a war with no fighting. There's something almost comical about it. Like two neighbors arguing over a fence that doesn't exist. But the more you think about it, the more you appreciate how this war exposes the limits of human control. Governments might declare wars, but life often refuses to follow the script. Meanwhile, on the Isles of Scilly, life went on. The locals, fishermen, farmers, children, were more concerned with the weather than with distant political conflicts. For them, the war was an invisible line in the sky, never touching their daily lives. A quirky detail. During this long war, the island's population remained small and tightly knit. There were no invading armies, no mass conscriptions. Instead, communities thrived quietly, passing down stories of storms and sea creatures rather than battles. Scholars often point to this war as a case study in how history can sometimes be stranger than fiction. It's a perfect example of the gulf between official records and lived experience. You feel a growing admiration for the people who lived through this. They endured a war that was mostly a formality but carried a heavy weight of meaning in the political world. Their resilience was quiet but profound. As the candle flickers low, you let yourself sink into a peaceful thought. Maybe the longest, quietest war is a testament not to conflict but to endurance. You sit quietly now, letting the weight of centuries settle around you like a soft blanket. The war dragged on, unnoticed and untouched, but beneath the surface, the world outside these islands was anything but peaceful. Empires rose and fell, revolutions ignited, and the map of Europe shifted dramatically. Yet here, in the shadow of those great events, the Isles of Scilly remained suspended in their peculiar calm. You think about how history often zooms in on the big moments, the battles, the treaties, the upheavals. But this war reminds you that much of history unfolds quietly, in the gaps between the headlines, in the slow churn of daily life. Imagine the islanders watching ships sail past, some from allies, others from rivals, none bringing conflict. They must have wondered if the war was more a story for those far away, in dusty offices and grand halls. There's a curious charm in that thought, that ordinary lives carried on, tethered loosely to the tides of history but largely untouched by its storms. Here's an odd little fact. During the Long War, the Isles never built fortifications or military installations. The war was declared but never enforced, a legal fiction more than a military reality. Scholars still argue about what this means for our understanding of war itself. Is war simply a state of hostility declared by governments, or does it require active engagement and consequence? This debate is part of the war's legacy, a reminder that history is complex, full of nuance, and often defies easy categorization. You close your eyes, hearing the distant call of a seabird and the gentle lapping of waves. The longest war without a battle might just be the most peaceful war in history. And maybe that's the real story, one of endurance, quiet survival, and the strange beauty found in silence. You feel the soft grass beneath your feet, the salty breeze brushing your face as you walk along the rugged coastline of the Isles of Scilly. The sea stretches endlessly, its calm surface belying the centuries of conflict that were never really fought here. It's a paradox, a war declared, yet peace reigning supreme. You begin to realize that this war is less about battles and more about the strange inertia of history. Sometimes, events unfold not because of fiery clashes but because of missed opportunities, forgotten promises, and stubborn refusal to admit mistakes. In the archives, you imagine dusty volumes filled with treaties and declarations, each one quietly adding another layer to the war that no one wanted to end. A conflict maintained by neglect rather than desire. Life on the islands, meanwhile, was a stark contrast. The rhythm of fishing boats, the bloom of wildflowers, and the laughter of children echoed a timeless continuity untouched by official hostilities. You might think the war would have brought hardship, but the reality was different. The war's peculiar peace became a backdrop for a simple, enduring way of life. Here's a quirky tidbit. The Dutch and English never officially signed a peace treaty to end this war on the Isles of Scilly. It simply faded away as priorities shifted, a war without a formal conclusion. Scholars still debate how to define this kind of conflict. Is it a war if it leaves no scars, no changes, no casualties? This question challenges the way we think about history and conflict. You pause, feeling the wind and the weight of time around you. This story isn't about violence or conquest. It's about endurance, the slow persistence of life amid the quiet hum of unresolved tension. And in that slow passage of time, you find something unexpectedly comforting, a reminder that not every conflict consumes the world. Some simply exist, quietly, like a whispered secret carried on the breeze. You're seated now on a weather-beaten bench overlooking the sea, the salty air filling your lungs as you reflect on the curious nature of this war. It's a war without battles, a war without casualties, a war that's almost too strange to believe. Yet, here it is, a historical anomaly stretching over 3 centuries. You start to appreciate the human side of this story. Think about the diplomats and politicians who kept the war alive on paper, even as the world moved on. Perhaps it was a matter of pride, stubbornness, or simply the inertia of bureaucracy. The locals, meanwhile, were caught in the middle of this strange dance. They lived their lives, tended their fields, and sailed their boats, all while officially being at war with a distant power they never saw. You can almost hear them shrugging. War? What war? It's funny how sometimes history's biggest events have the smallest impact on everyday life. This war is a perfect example. It existed mostly in the minds of governments, not in the reality of people's daily experiences. A quirky detail that might surprise you. Despite the long duration of the war, there were no significant political or territorial changes on the Isles of Scilly related to the conflict. The islands remained stable, peaceful, and largely untouched. Scholars often use this war as an example to challenge traditional ideas about what constitutes a war. Is it simply a declaration and diplomatic stance, or does it require real engagement and consequences? This debate is important because it forces us to reconsider the narratives we tell about history. Sometimes, the absence of action is itself an action, a statement about human nature and political will. As the sun dips lower, casting golden light across the water, you feel a quiet awe. This war's legacy is a testament to the power of endurance, the resilience of ordinary life, and the strange, beautiful silence that can exist even amid declared conflict. You wander along a pebble-strewn beach, the gentle murmur of waves soothing your thoughts as you reflect on how this war fits into the larger tapestry of history. It's a quiet thread woven through centuries of turmoil and change, an odd pause amid the chaos. You realize the war teaches something unique about human nature and politics, that sometimes, conflict is maintained not through violence, but through stubbornness and neglect. The longest war with no casualties is a lesson in patience, and perhaps in the futility of some disputes. You think about how different the world was during these 300 years. Monarchs ruled, empires expanded and contracted, revolutions erupted, but on these islands, none of that translated into warfare. You ponder how this war might have been different if the islands were more strategically important or populated. Would it have escalated into real battles, or would the stalemate have held? Here's a quirky bit. The Isles of Scilly were once used as a refuge by royalists during the English Civil War. Yet, even then, the conflict with the Dutch never turned violent locally. It's almost as if the islands had a shield of peaceful stubbornness around them. Scholars still argue whether the war is an example of a paper war, or a genuine, albeit inactive, conflict. This discussion opens a window into how we define war and peace in historical terms. As twilight deepens, you feel the soft hum of time passing, a reminder that not all wars leave scars, and not all peace is loud. Some stories live quietly, waiting for those curious enough to listen. You take a deep breath, letting the cool evening air fill your lungs. This long, silent war is a strange and beautiful story about endurance, absurdity, and the quiet strength of ordinary life. You stand now at the edge of the Isles, the vast Atlantic stretching before you, endless and patient. This final stretch of our journey through the longest war without a battle brings you face to face with a paradox, a war that lasted centuries yet changed almost nothing. You reflect on what this means for how we understand conflict. This war challenges the idea that war must be loud, bloody, and heroic. Instead, it shows you that sometimes, war can be quiet, strange, and almost invisible. You think about the resilience of the people who lived through this, how they carried on with their lives, undeterred by distant declarations, wrapped in a calm that belied the official status of war. It's a humbling reminder that history is made not only by generals and kings but by ordinary people living their daily lives in the shadow of events far beyond their control. A quirky note to end on. The Isles of Scilly today are a peaceful haven for wildlife and travelers, far removed from the centuries-old war that once defined their existence. Nature, it seems, is the true victor here. Scholars often say this war invites us to rethink our ideas about history, conflict, and the stories we tell ourselves. It's a case study in how human affairs are sometimes shaped more by inertia and forgetfulness than by intention. As you take one last look at the horizon, you feel a gentle calm settle over you. This war may have lasted 300 years, but it teaches you something timeless. Sometimes, the greatest conflicts are the quietest ones. Like and share this video with dear. Subscribe our YouTube channel The Best Way of Sleeping.